Yeah. Okay, it's after 2 o'clock now, so I'm going to start this meeting of the Audit Committee. So, welcome everybody. Let's just start with apologies for absence. Do we have any?
Yeah, apologies for absence from County Councillor Peter Clark.
Thank you for that. I'll just see who's here who are not councillor members of the committee. I know we've got Mr. Wathen from Internal Audit, and next to him, Mr.
Yeah, David Walton, Audit Manager.
Right, and Mark Howcroft from Finance. Secretaries Wendy Bernard. Mr. Taylor from Arling Close is just coming in. He's going to be involved in the training that you've seen is on the agenda. Then we've got Mr. Hoggins at the front. Who else? We've got Mr. Jones at the back, Mr. Saunders, I believe. And anyone else want to identify themselves? Thank you. Apologies to anyone I didn't recognise. Yes.
Leslie Russell from the Treasury Management team.
Oh, right. Welcome. Thanks very much. Yes, Mr. Davis down there at the front. Yeah. That's everyone? Okay, good. We're going to probably move the agenda a little bit from where it stands at the moment. The scheduled Treasury Management training doesn't really need to be live streamed, and perhaps shouldn't be. So we're going to move that right till the end after we've considered item 18. So that'll really be a training session for members at the end of this meeting, but it won't be live streamed. Now, declarations of interest. I'm happy to take these as we go along, but if anyone wants to make a declaration now, please do so.
Under the schools one, non-prejudicial or personal interest.
Right, thank you, Councillor. Public open forum. I don't believe there are any members of the public or press present. So we'll move over that and we'll go on to the minutes of the previous meeting. Does anyone have any comments or observations on the minutes of the last meeting?
Prepared to move them, Chairman.
Okay, I'll accept the minutes as written then. Thank you very much. So, next item on the agenda is to note the action list from our last meeting, which was 19th of September 2017. Now, the first item we've got there relates to the events and risks of events. We've got that on the agenda for later on. The next one is implementation of Audit Committee recommendations concerning children and young persons. I believe that we don't have anything today, but do we have any news on that?
Thanks, Jim. I've spoken to the Chief Officer concerned and he's assured me that he's working on progress and he will report back to Audit Committee in January.
Thank you for that. Okay, well then I'll move on to unsatisfactory audit opinions, and this is just to note that we're going to get a report on unsatisfactory audit opinions at the January meeting. And I'll just welcome Terry Lewis from the Welsh Audit Office who's just come into the meeting. Let's move on to self-assessment of skills and Treasury training. We've got that now. I just mentioned it earlier. It's coming at the end. Next item, audited statement of accounts and the ISO 260 response. There was some information for Val Smith, I think. I think that's been provided, so I think we just note that as done. Onto the revised information strategy. There were some questions which I think have been answered and have been appended to the action list. So if that's all right with everybody. And then when we move on to the annual improvement report, there was a Welsh Audit Office opinion on the Constitution. We've had some information from Robert Tranter, which I think settles it. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. So I'll move on then to the 6 monthly report on CPR exemptions. I think this is for Mr. Wathen, yeah?
Thank you, Chairman. Basically, members, this is a 6-month report which I bring to Audit Committee on the update of the contract procedure rules and the exemptions that are requested and appropriately authorised, to give you some assurance or not, or raise some concerns around the process in seeking exemptions from our normal contract procedure rules. Just as a bit of background, we've got contract procedure rules in place to make sure that we're spending public money appropriately and efficiently, and there's a whole set of rules which we normally need to comply with when we're undergoing some procurement process. Inevitably, there will be some occasions when those rules can't be applied, and therefore you seek an exemption. The operational manager will seek an exemption, which they need to do so through my team, and we've administered that process in terms of making sure that they have been appropriately authorised by a head of service or chief officer, or in some cases a cabinet member. So this is just the 6-month update. So I'll just take you through briefly. Relates to the period of November 2016 to May 2017. In paragraph 5.3, there's a table of all the exemptions that have been requested since we started running this process, which goes back a number of years. And you can see that in the last period, 15 exemptions were requested, which is quite average, really, for a period, for a 6-month period. And to make members aware that the period previously was June 2016 to October 2016. There was 13 requests for exemptions, and 5 were not returned to internal audit. We've dealt with 4 of those, and 1 was not required. So, and that's been reported into Audit Committee previously. But for this period, November 16 to May 17, 15 requests for exemptions were required, but 9 were not returned to the internal audit team, which means we just can't verify whether or not they've been authorised correctly. So there are still some outstanding, and what we've noticed as well is that some of the exemption forms that are coming back to us are not being completed properly, and there's some instances where forms are just being used on an ad hoc basis by some operational managers. So the message isn't good at the moment in terms of compliance with the process, but what I will do is remind everybody who's requested an exemption form to either get back to me with an authorised form or a justification of why they didn't need to go down that exemption route in the end. And I also remind heads of service of the proper process in terms that needs to be complied with in seeking the exemption, i.e. requesting the form, which is sequentially numbered for my team, getting it authorised, and then returning it back to the team. So I'll give that commitment to Audit Committee and you as members, Chairman. And I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, I'll throw it open to questions and observations. I've got Councillor Easton first.
No. Well, thank you, Chair. That's better. Mr. Wartham, why do we have to keep emphasising through this committee the compliance with regulations? They keep coming back to us time and time again. Has the message not got through to the senior officers that it's very important this is done? Because we spend a lot of time on it talking in this committee, yet there seems to be a lot of ill discipline in getting the requirements you want.
Thank you, Councillor. We do remind chief officers and managers on a from time to time. I will do that on a more formal basis moving forward. It's probably been on an informal basis up to now, but I'll make sure that we do it on a more formal basis so everybody's aware of the requirement.
Thank you.
Councillor Watkins.
Thank you. Are there any particular departments, or is this problem spread out across the authority? Are there particular areas that actually need to be looked at in more detail? Okay, as part of the report, what I will also do, if there's a need, is identify any trends. For this particular period, it's kind of across all service areas. So there's no one particular area where there's a problem. This is just coming from a number of areas. If we do identify trends, I'll make sure that that's included in the report in the future, both in terms of non-compliance and the number of exemptions that are required as well, because if that's a trend, that needs to be looked into as well. So I'll include that next time round.
Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to, I guess, supplement what Andrew's just added there, and to say that, as you clearly observe, internal audit at the moment currently have this role in, I guess, policing the exemption forms and obviously reporting that back into Audit Committee. I guess the scope of my brief having been recently altered, widened, I've taken on board procurement as part of my brief, and spoken to Andrew ahead of this meeting, and having looked this report over, I think a conversation is needed here just in terms of where the gatekeeping role sits in terms of the exemption process. And there's a question mark there in terms of whether procurement should be taking some ownership of that. I think that in itself affords us an opportunity just to look at the current arrangements and as to how they can maybe be put in place more seamlessly. There's no criticism to the current arrangement, it's just a recognition, I think, when we look at the situation that Andrew's reported, where of the 15 exemptions in the period, and of which 9 have not been returned, we do get into situations, I'm not saying this is right, but we get into situations where managers who are obviously incredibly busy, they may draw down an exemption from internal audit for very good reason at that point in time, but circumstances may change and they may then not require the exemption. I guess part of the frustration, I'm sure, with Andrew is that the manager has then probably gone ahead and taken a different course of action, but not had the courtesy to go simply go back to Andrew just to confirm that the exemption form is no longer required, so he can update his records. So we just need to, as I said, take the opportunity, I think, for myself to sit down with Andrew, Scott James, who heads up our procurement, and to look at the current arrangements. And hopefully I can, offer the committee some reassurance, really, in terms of the tightening of the arrangements going forward.
Thanks for that. Thanks very much. Councillor Smith?
Mr Davis has just answered the point that I was going to raise under 6.6, because it relates to 3.3 as well, where it says, not be as some managers and operational managers are not as familiar with contract procedure rules and the exemption process. And I at the end had put, why not? But anyway, I think you've addressed that, Mr Davis, and also the concluding paragraph, we're going to have a tighter control and a system whereby everything's noted. Thank you.
Okay, well, I note the recommendations on this item includes that if justifications are not accepted, consideration should be given to calling in the respective operational officer and their respective head of service to further account for the reasons why they could not comply with the council's contract procedure rules. Now, we have done this in the past. This is actually just a statement of the way the committee has operated in the past, in that if we have concerns about contract procedure rules, we will ask the appropriate managers to come in and answer some questions. Now, we've got a number outstanding in the table, and what I propose to do is that we call in the managers for 3 of the items. One was 219, the Abergavenny Public Realm Scheme, which was £300,000. One is the 210, the redesign work for Abergavenny Community Hub, which is just under 100,000, and 211 road repairs, which is 57,000. Now, because of discussions I've had with Mr. Watson and others very recently, there may be developments in the near future in terms of finding out more about why these forms weren't returned or weren't returned properly or whatever. So I will not issue those invitations if in the meantime we receive a satisfactory response. But I propose that it's now my intention to ask these 3 areas, which are the higher value areas, to come in and talk to us about why they didn't comply. So unless there's an objection from committee members to that, I propose that's what we're going to do. Right, thanks very much, everyone. I'll move on then to Curbcraft, which I think is an update from Mr. Hoggins. Is that right?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members will be aware that in March we received a report from WAO expressing concerns about the management of the Curbcraft scheme within the authority. At the time, Council adopted an action plan to deliver improvements in those areas, and then in July Cabinet adopted new procedures to undertake curbcraft training within the schools. Also within the action plan were various other requirements, as well as looking at new procedures, it was to look at new monitoring arrangements and also to look at the governance arrangements. In particular, the action plan requires us to report to the Audit Committee and Cabinet on a 6-monthly basis until such time as they are satisfied that there are adequate controls in place to ensure that the safeguarding aspects of curbcraft and the service generally is being delivered satisfactorily. As such, I would suggest to members that you look at this as a 6-monthly report, and one of the recommendations is that I come back to you again in a further 6 months and give you another update to see whether or not at that time you are then satisfied with the controls and procedures and measures which are in place. That report will also be going to, this report will similarly be going to Cabinet, and at that time will also be going to Cabinet as well. If at that time you are satisfied with the monitoring and performance arrangements in place, then that ends your involvement with it until such time as you feel it's appropriate perhaps to consider it again. But in terms of the action plan, it fulfills that aspect. So this is by way of a 6-monthly update on where we've got to with the action plan. And as I say, new procedures were adopted at Cabinet in July. The curbcraft training programme has recommenced in this September, and training is underway in accordance with that. Monitoring arrangements, I've attached 2 fairly simple documents to this report, but which provide feedback on what is taking place and where it's about to take place. The one document is actually the document which we use to report to Welsh Government, because actually we undertake this scheme on behalf of Welsh Government. There's no statutory requirement upon the authority to do so or for schools to actually take advantage of the scheme. However, if we receive the grant, we take the grant from Welsh Government, as we do, then we provide them with quarterly feedback on what's been done. That report, in terms of monitoring, provides you with the number of students which have been trained and the various skills which they have been trained in. And the second document provides you with those schools which are in the programme to be trained and those which are to be trained in, where training is to be offered in the future. So they are reasonably straightforward schemes, but they offer some assurance that the monitoring is under place and offers the opportunity for feedback from schools and parents that, that they are satisfied with the scheme. Perhaps, Mr. Chairman, as I say, I will come forward again in 6 months' time with a further report to offer you another opportunity to look again in some detail at where we are with the scheme and what monitoring has been placed, what training has been undertaken, and at that point you'll be able to again look at this report. But perhaps at this stage, Mr. Chairman, maybe you could open it to questions.
Yes, I'll do exactly that. Questions and observations, please. Councillor Higginson.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. The risk issues I particularly looking at, national cycle training, Amber, subject to resource issues being overcome. And although I'm a motorcyclist, I'm not going to declare an interest on this, but motorcycle training is Amber, subject to bike train Wales utilising funding to deliver more training. Could you tell us where we are with that, please?
Unfortunately, that level of detail, no, but I can get a written report to members on that area in particular. The grant actually covers more than curbcraft. and it does include these Pro Plus training, Pro Pass training, sorry, Pro Plus is different, Pro Pass training, and as you say, the motorcycle training. So I unfortunately, I can't give you an update on the detail of that. I did see it there, and I did anticipate that might come forward, I'd have to say, but it is outside of the Curbcraft element. But I will get a written response for members in relation to those aspects. Because whilst they are, as I say, outside of the Curbcraft, they are of interest because they're in that Welsh Government return. So I appreciate that request, and I will get a note back. Thank you.
Councillor Eason.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'll declare an interest as a personal interest on Ysgolly Finn, which I just noticed. What does this training actually entail? Because I know Ysgolly Finn particularly is on a busy lane, busy sandy lane, but there is no official monitors of pupils on the road. They do have them inside the school. And equally, Castle Park School, which is on a very busy road. What training is actually given, and who is it given to, so that it can be implemented in a safe manner on them and other schools, actually?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We work largely to Welsh Government guidelines on the level of training which is provided. But in relation to the three aspects there, Skill 1, Skill 2 and Skill 3. Skill 1 is choosing a safe place to cross the road. Skill 2 is crossing safely at parked cars. And Skill 3 is crossing safely near junctions. So that's the type of training which is given. If you want to look in more detail at what procedures are followed, then I would take you back to the July report to Cabinet, which outlined in some detail the procedures which are undertaken by those staff and the volunteers when they go to the school. That is by way of ensuring they have records of the children being taught, that they have the relevant approvals in place, that the school has agreed that it take place. There is then a risk assessment undertaken by our staff to assess where or where not that training may take place. So those aspects all form part of the risk assessment, which forms part of the procedure. If you wish to go back to that, then I'll take you back to the July report and look at some detail in those aspects.
That's reasonably satisfactory, but in terms of the schools in particular, where can I go, or any member go, to see the lists or whatever of persons who have been trained in this aspect? We don't have school crossing controllers at either of those two schools, and I don't think many of the schools got them these days. So where's the record kept? Is it kept within the school? Is it kept within highways? For example, I'm chair of the Health and Safety Committee in Ysgolly Finn. I know about Curbcraft, I know about the processes, but this has never been talked about within the Health and Safety Committee in Ysgolly Finn.
Should the school request the names and the records, then those records are with the road safety staff, and they're kept per school, per individual school. So that's where they're held, and it's purely a request to the road safety team. Can you provide that information? It would be made available.
Councillor Watkins.
Thanks. From what I recollect, the Curbcraft scheme, the new implementation, required fairly significant volunteer resource, having kind of prime volunteers who would go in and take the training, who were fully DBS checked, etc. And in the last July meeting, there weren't sufficient volunteers when we met last time and talked about it. Have those volunteers all been found? Have we got all the resource in place that's needed in terms of that setup for putting out the whole scheme?
Thank you, Chair. Actually, the situation which we found ourselves in prior to the new procedure was that we had a long list of volunteers. There was 80 plus volunteers. And that is what caused some concern to Wales Audit Office colleagues as to whether or not we had those records sufficiently in place in relation to DBS and references and medical checks. The new process which we look at only requires a much more limited number of volunteers at any point in time. So we try to reduce it down to the minimum would be 6. So rather than having a database of 80 to keep alive, we would reduce it down to a much more limited number. The assurance which I can offer members is that if there's insufficient volunteers or staff to undertake the works and the training, then the training will not take place. Nor will any volunteers be used where the checks are not in place either, and we have those now caught on a central record. Because again, one of the concerns raised by what WAO was that we didn't have a central record. Whilst we did have individual records, we didn't have a central record. We now have that central record in place, and that's the level of assurance which we can now offer. So it's just a long answer, very short question, sorry, but it's no longer a long list of 80, it's down to a much more manageable number, and we have assurance that we have those checks in place.
And can I just check, you've actually got those 6 volunteers, because it sounded like there was going to be quite a call on them to go around so many schools.
Yes, we try and keep a core of 6, but that will change. They will drop off, come on as time goes on, and particularly as you move between one area and another area, they will drop off and come on. But rather than keeping this big long list of 80, it was 80 plus my recollection, is they'll keep a much more limited list. It will change though, however, and in the instances where we have insufficient volunteers to carry out the work, then the paid staff, and we have 1 full-time and 2 part-time staff who provide that, will carry out that training in any event, and they will limit the size of their training to suit, or extend the training out over a longer period of time to suit. So they're managing it always against the level of resource they have available.
Right then, okay, well, I'll just note what the recommendation was for this paper, that we note the action taken to date to implement the action plan, which I think we have done. And we've said that we will approve receipt of a further update report in 6 months' time, so that's been told to us. Yes, Councillor Easton.
Thank you, Chair. Could I have a 2.4 recommendation that we have a little bit more detail about the numbers of persons who are volunteering, not names, in each of these schools in 6 months' time when we come back with maybe 13 schools?
Okay, that's noted then, thank you. And that brings us back to the point 2.2 on recommendations, that members note performance measures in place and consider whether further measures are appropriate. And I believe we've done that. So I'm going to move on then. Thank you, Mr. Hoggins.
Thank you, Mr.
I'm going to move on then to the mid-year Treasury report. And I'm looking at the authors. I think we've got Leslie Russell and John Davis, but how do you want to deal with this?
I'll explain that.
Yeah.
Right, myself and Leslie are going to try to double team this. Previously, you would have expected me to present this report, but what I'm actually trying to do is to give some of my managers some experience of the audit and member environment, so they can better anticipate the questions and include in future reports. So I appreciate this is probably a bit of a baptism by fire, but I will leave Leslie to explain the report to you, and we'll probably take any questions jointly.
Hello. If I burst into a cough, I shall have to have a little break for some water. But so I'm here to report to you on the Treasury management activities of Monmouthshire County Council. Later you'll have some training by Chris Taylor from Arling Close, so it may be that you've got further questions following the training. So if so, just get in contact with me via the email at the bottom of the report. In the report, we monitor our activities against the guidelines, limits and targets as set out in the Treasury Management Strategy Statement for 17-18, approved by the Council in March. The authority is a net borrower, but due to the timing of grant, capital receipts and other income coming in, not being aligned with the timing of payments due, we usually have cash we need to hold securely until needed. This involves making investments. Treasury management processes need to effectively manage the risks associated with those activities and minimise the difference between our net interest payments and interest earned, as long as consistent with risk management. We adhere to various codes and guidance notes which state we should firstly ensure the security and liquidity of invested funds is appropriate and only then try to improve yield. The Audit Committee is identified as being the committee responsible for scrutiny of such reports on the Treasury function of the authority. A number of legislative changes are being enacted around this time. There are revisions to the Treasury Management Code and Prudential Codes, which include the acquisition of investment properties, not just cash investments, into the scope of the Treasury Management Code. A revision to the 2018-19 Treasury Strategy may be necessary should it not incorporate all the changes by the new code, which is probably going to come out after Christmas. A second Markets in Financial Instruments Directed, or MiFID II, comes into force on January the 3rd. The main impact for the authority is that if we do not act up from being a retail client to a professional client of other financial institutions that we deal with by January, we may not have access to the financial institutions, including our Treasury Management Advisors, Arlingclose, that we have now. This could limit our Treasury management options. We are currently working towards professional status, but we will be reviewing this in the new year to make sure that it's acceptable from a cost and risk perspective. To be professional, we need to increase our level of investments to £10 million.
Sorry, Val.
The paragraph 3.6, just explain to me, please, that change to professional client.
Okay.
I think that's cool, but I think that would be an appropriate question to ask after Leslie's made her presentation.
All right, yes.
That's rather the way I'd do it.
Yes,
so
that's fine.
I'll come back to you then.
I was confused there. And
it's a core issue, and I would raise it myself if you didn't. So
that's fine.
yeah, okay.
It may be, in fact, that it's appropriate to leave it for Chris to explain as part of the training, but I can have a go as well, so that's fine. The detailed mid-year Treasury report is included in Appendix 1 to the main report. So, borrowing activity. The authority has increased its loans by £16 million to £105 million during the first half of this financial year, mainly due to the higher than normal level of spend on the 21st Century Schools programme. The 16 million of new loans taken out in that 6 months have been short-term loans, which increase the percentage of variable rate loans that we hold, and hence the interest rate exposure has increased during this period. This keeps costs low, but increases the exposure to interest rates. So interest rate rises. As short-term interest rates have remained and are likely to remain for a significant period lower than long-term rates, the authority determined this was more cost-effective in the short term. However, to maintain an acceptable level of certainty, we have since committed to £5 million of 3-year borrowing since the end of September. Investment activity. The authority held £5 million of invested funds at the 31st of March and £7 million at the 30th of September. Cash flow forecasts indicate that during the rest of 2017, the authority's investment balances could remain at this low level, although we have committed to a slight increase due to the MiFID II regulations. The security of capital has remained the authority's main investment objective. This has been maintained by following the authority's counterparty policy as set out in its Treasury Management Strategy Statement for 2017-18, which also includes limits for counterparty and investment type. The Financial Services Act 2013 will be put in place by January 2019. The largest UK banks, including our current bank, Barclays, must separate its core retail banking from its investment banking. Monmouthshire's bank account will be outside the ring-fenced bank, which is the retail part. Revenue performance. Our budget for interest payable in 2017-18 is forecast to underspend to £750,000, principally as a result of MRP and interest relating to new capital schemes not having the expected impact in 2017-18 that was anticipated. Instead, the impact will emerge more slowly over future years. There's also been a saving of £200,000 due to the overall level of borrowing required reduced compared to the budgeted amount. This is mainly due to slippage in the capital programme. The authority can confirm that it has complied with its prudential and treasury management indicators, There's a lot more detail about those in the Appendix 1 in the main report. If anyone got any questions?
Well, thanks very much for all that. I know that some of that was technical, and we're not all completely experienced in this area.
Not yet, Chair.
Not yet. Hopefully we will be by the end of this afternoon, because we're going for some training later on. I think we seriously considered putting this paper back to next time so that we could have the training first, but I think one option, which was to do this right at the end, would have been just too long a day. I think maybe if we can just sort of concentrate on main concepts at the moment, and think that some more of it may, some more of the detail or the knowledge we need will come from the training later on. And then perhaps we could come back to this issue. There's another report. Is the next time, Mark?
Next time in January,
yeah.
As members will be fully conversant and confident in Treasury management activities, you will actually be considering the Treasury strategy for the next financial year. So it's quite pertinent to get the half year out of the way now, rather than actually have pushed it back.
Yeah,
so,
right, okay.
That's hence why we're doing it a little bit backwards in terms of before you've had the training. But if I can give you just a context on some of the aspects.
I think you might need to turn your microphone on. Sorry.
Is that any better? Beg your pardon. One of the changes in terms of financial regulation is that they will be categorised institutions that invest as either professional investors or retail investors. Those institutions that provide advice along that will have a different standard that they're expected to required to meet as to whether that institution is either a retail investor or an investment or a professional investor. We've got a bit of a decision to make because we don't actually use a lot of the products and instruments that a professional investor is entitled to use. That's because in our strategy we've kept things largely simple, and our investments tend to be very short-term in nature. So we could probably get away with retail status, but actually in protecting a retail investor, the agencies that you deal with are expected to give you more information, provide you with more protection in terms of you understanding what the consequence of that decision is, and as a result of which there are probably more costs involved in terms of that administration. So ideally, from a local authority perspective, it will probably be more useful to retain professional status but not actually use the full extent of it than be categorised as a retail consideration. But it doesn't sit particularly well with us that we're having to borrow money simply to invest to reach that £10 million threshold that is required to be a professional investor. So we're having a bit of a think about that internally. We've been informed that actually, whilst it is coming in from January, there are no immediate considerations in terms of responses from our Treasury managers. That means that we will be cut off on the 4th of January if we haven't made a decision about it. And actually, a lot of the evolving thoughts around MiFID will be around this next 4 weeks or so, when it will actually crystallise in terms of the responses to it.
Right. Well, at that point, you're welcome to ask any questions or make any observations you wish to at this stage. Councillor Feekins.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mark. Leslie, just regarding 3.8, the borrowing activity. 30th September 2017, the authority held £105 million in loans, 105.3. Is that drawn down? Is that are they loans that are drawn down, or are we using churn to fund part of that?
Right. Our capital financing requirement, i.e. the level of loans that we would normally derive if we funded all our capital programme by loans, is about 135 million. The 105 is a level of actual loans that we've taken out, and you may have heard me previously talk about internal borrowing or temporary borrowing. That's where we use our cash flow and our receipts that we get in on a day-to-day basis to avoid taking out loans. So the 105 is reflective of actual loans that we've incurred.
Further question, yeah?
Thank you. Just in response to that, and just to clarify this point in my mind, really, we at the moment don't charge anything for internal rates of return. We don't charge anything for internal borrowing. And second to that, if we were to charge something for internal borrowing, would that give us a scenario whereby we would be creating a cash flow internally, although it's a Rob and Peter to pay Paul situation, but we would in effect be creating our own cash flow?
I think it might be a case of simply moving the deck chairs around to give people a better view of the iceberg. I mean, it doesn't actually realise any new money from doing that. That's simply an exercise of recharging. I mean, the sorts of things that we actually utilise is things like our council tax receipts, etc. As described in the report, slippage means that we're not actually borrowing to the extent that we predicted we would do. We get large grants in at particular periods of the year, largely quarterly, etc. But sometimes the expenditure doesn't follow those paths. So there's no one obviously to charge for the purpose of that internal borrowing. It just means that actually in using our resources before we borrow, effectively that makes the borrowing cheaper overall because we're not borrowing more and paying more interest than we ultimately need to.
Councillor Eason.
Thank you once again, Chair. Sorry, I got a cough as well. I'd like to ask you 3 questions on 3.1, 3.8 and 3.18. I'll start off with 3.1. It says in 3.1, the Treasury Manager is the manager of the local authorities' investments, etc., etc., etc. How confident are you that this will be kept consistent in the future, as a general comment? And the second one is 3.8, which is a bit more on what Councillor Feakin said, was that on the comp question he made, what is the higher than normal level of spend on the 21st century schools in that period of time? Because you note on there also that it's based on grants received before the 31st of March 2017. The third question is 3.18, which is you had an underspend of £348,000 as a minimum revenue provision based on the fact, you had an underspend of £340,000 on the solar farm, but it was offset by an overspend of £250,000 of set-aside capital receipts. How long do you see this as a sustainable way of reducing or getting rid of any overspends? Is it a good long-term venture? And if it is as good as it seems on paper there, should we not build more solar farms in Monmouthshire?
Yes, Mark.
Right. I suspect in relation to 3.1 in terms of how sustainable are some of the decisions, you'll have a better reflection on that after the training in terms of understanding what information we have available as officers to actually model future capital requirements, whether we need to use borrowing, capital receipts, etc. And those reports actually get communicated via council reports when we actually set things like the capital programme and the revenue budget in February. But perhaps if we wait until we have the training at the end there, you could perhaps ask that question then if it's not any clearer.
Okay.
3.8. What I would describe to you is that the Treasury management is a bit odd in terms of it's the management of cash flows. And so when we talk about not incurring expenditure in relation to 21st century schools, we actually model when we think those cash flows are likely to occur and when we're likely to take out those borrowings. What you don't see is actually those on the face of, say, the revenue or the capital account, because they are those costs are incurred in the year. They're just incurred later or earlier than we actually anticipate them being.
So how do you estimate this would be reflected in March 2018?
Normal level of spend during 6 months. Yeah, because what we've tried to do first and foremost is use the capital receipts rather than borrowing. But what we do find is that where the capital receipt levels aren't sufficient to cover the level that we've presumed, we undertake a level of temporary borrowing to compensate for that. That's always included in the revenue monitoring report as a potential and a cost. What we have as a compensatory adjustment to 21st century schools is that often we will get payments on account from Welsh Government who are part funding that scheme. That means that we will get income in that we wouldn't necessarily have spent or incurred a cost against at the time when we receive that money. And you had a question about 3.18. this is a one-year consequence. It's simply the fact that you charge MRP in the year following an asset being brought into operation, and actually at the end of last year the solar farm was still treated as an asset under construction. So that's where you get a one-year saving in terms of MRP not charged on the solar farm, compensated by the fact that part of our model last year was presuming that our level of capital receipts would be sufficient to repay or reduce our capital financing requirement. We didn't actually make that repayment, and therefore our capital borrowing costs were more. And that's where the compensatory adjustment comes in terms of a cost of 250,000 that we weren't anticipating.
Okay, so on the basis that we got one solar farm, not that you shouldn't build any more, the fact that the solar farm was there as a one-year asset, it wouldn't be prudential to just build solar farms on the basis of making profit.
No, Councillor. What I obviously haven't explained very well is that there's a one-year treasury consequence to this, but actually there is also a revenue stream that comes off the back of the solar farm that's a 20-year basis. That's a completely separate monitoring exercise that isn't treasury related. That goes through the normal revenue monitoring account. And when I last looked at it, there was actually an annual surplus of just short of £100,000 this year as a result of the solar farm's activity.
Councillor Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's just worth pointing out there that that particular item 318 isn't just about the solar farm, it's about the delays on J&E block as well. So, you know, don't get too hung up on the solar farm, which is, as Mark said, doing particularly well. It would do even better if Western Power didn't keep making us switch it off because of their infrastructure failing, but they've sorted that out now. I'm delighted to say. The other point I was gonna make, and I'm not sure that everybody quite got it from Mark's explanation, is when it came to the Welsh Government money on the 21st century schools, we were actually given permission to use all of their money first instead of having to match it all of the time. So there was a substantial delay in us actually having to make provision to fund some of the expenditure ourselves. So as I say, you know, they gave us 40 million and we spent their 40 million before we had to do anything else.
Yes, do.
One of the points I just wanted to make on that 21st century schools comment was that I was referring specifically to the fact that our level of loans increased from April to September, not comparing it to any budget. So I was, if you have a balanced budget and everything happens exactly as it should and when it should, then in theory your level of cash should be fairly constant. But what I was alluding to there is really a timing difference, so that we, because we were using receipts we'd received previously, or capital grant we'd received previously, that the level of loans had to go up from the start of the year. So the income was already in at the 1st of April, and I was just comparing the levels of loans from the 1st of April to at the end of September.
Councillor Feekins.
Thank you, Chair. And this is just as a footnote really for Tony, Councillor Eaton. The solar farms are completely underpinned by subsidies paid by government, and those subsidies have significantly been reduced, and therefore the attractiveness of building solar farms now is significantly less. So therefore it's not as attractive for us.
Thank you for that. Okay then, well the recommendation here was that we review the Treasury management activities in the first half of the year and discuss with officers any changes to process that should be considered for incorporation. I think, yes, we've reviewed it, and I think we'll be in a better position after the training to take these matters up in more detail with the finance team. So thank you very much, and thank you. I'll move on to the next item then, which is our Q2 progress report from internal audit.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Again, members, this is one of the regular reports I bring to you for information on a quarterly basis. and this relates to the first 6 months of the year, so up to and including 30th September 2017. The information within is cumulative, and it's twofold. The report, it gives you assurance on the internal control environment via the opinions we issue as part of our audit programme, which is as per the audit plan which you've agreed previously. And then the second part is to talk about the performance of the team against some benchmark performance indicators. So in terms of this particular report, we're progressing against the plan. The work is underway and we're moving forward. We've completed 22 audit jobs, although not necessarily all of them will attract an audit opinion. At the moment, those issued, only 2 have attracted an opinion. So it's a bit difficult to give you complete assurance at this stage of the process, but things generally do pick up in quarters 3 and quarters 4 from previous experience. So the opinions that we've issued are, one is considerable and one is limited. One is on Chepstow School and one's on the Borough Theatre. And we've also been involved with some grant claim work where we've given an opinion whether it's qualified or unqualified. And the definition of our opinions are included in the appendix of the report. We've also been involved in finalising a significant level of work that was at draft report stage as at the 31st of March 2017. Some have been finalised with respective opinions reported, and some are still in progress waiting to be finalised. We've also been involved with some significant and sensitive special investigations, both myself and David, which does impact on our ability to move things forward in terms of the audit plan. The audit team are working through the planned work, but then there's a slight delay with us, having a bottleneck because we're involved in the work of reviewing that work and getting those draft reports out to operational managers, which is reflected in our performance. So, with regards to the acceptance of audit recommendations, operational managers are agreeing with our recommendations and have agreed to implement 99% of them. So that means they are agreeing to implement a change to their process to improve the internal control environment. With regards to draft reports, it's taken us 21 days on average to issue them following the finalisation of the audit work, and 16 days to issue final reports. We did have a bit of a blip at the beginning of the year, and we are catching up. And you'll see from the appendix, which I'll refer to in a moment, that is not as good as our targets. It's not as good as where I'd like to be at this stage of the year, but it is better than where we were this time last year. So overall, we've achieved 23% of our audit plan against 33% last year and a target of 30%. And the main reason for that, as outlined already, is that David and myself have been involved with significant and sensitive special investigations. The team itself is up to speed. We have a full complement of staff, so the establishment is good. And we get involved with the performance indicators, which we, on a corporate basis, before they're submitted to Welsh Government for a proper approval. And we also get involved with the National Fraud Initiative, and we administer that from within our team. So if I could refer members to Appendix 1, that identifies the reports that we've worked on and issued opinions on up for the first 6 months, and the grant claims, which follows on to non-opinion work, where we're given audit advice, getting involved with other agreements, annual governance statements, etc. Appendix 2 outlines and gives a definition of our audit opinions and how we risk rate them in terms of how we actually arrive at those audit opinions. They are balanced. They do include strengths and weaknesses, so we do believe we provide a balanced audit report. And then Appendix 3 shows the performance of the team over the 6-month period. And what I've done for members' information is to provide a quarter-by-quarter comparison and a year-by-year comparison, so you can see how we've compared against both. The highlighted version is quarter 2, which is the period we're talking about. Happy to take any questions, Chairman.
Questions and observations on that paper, please? Councillor Murphy.
Just an observation, really, Chair. It's quite pleasing to see Chepstow School coming in as considerable. I was part of the team that was looking at the recovery plan, and with Mark, who did a substantial amount of work in guiding them through that. And as I say, it's good to see that report is coming back to reflect that.
Thank you for that. Councillor Smith.
A very silly question. I presume when you're giving the days for a job to be done, it's based on a 5-day working week. Let's give an example.
Yes, it is, yeah.
That's right. Thank you.
All right then. Well, this is a regular report we get. Councillor Strong, sorry.
Thank you, Chairman. It's just the Borough Theatre, a limited opinion on that. Is that ongoing? And is it really as bad as we've been led to believe?
Thank you, Jim. I'm not sure what you're led to believe, so I'm not sure I can answer that question, really. But we do an audit review based on controls which we expect to be in place, which we agree with the management up front, and we've issued a draft report on that. One of the other reports I'll bring into Audit Committee is an update on unsatisfactory or unfavourable opinions, and there'll be more information following in that report. That report will come to Audit Committee in January, so there'll be more meat on the bone as to why we felt it was unfavourable that particular time.
Thank you very much for that. Then I'll note that we accept the recommendation that the committee note the audit opinions issued and the progress made by section towards meeting 1718 operational audit plan and the performance indicators at the 6-month stage. Is this the 6-month stage? Yeah, of the financial year. Thank you very much. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is to get the proper title, overview of performance management arrangements, and this is going to be presented by Richard Jones. Can I just ask you, Richard, the next item on the agenda, let's see, the audit of MCC assessment performance for information and confirmation of compliance. That's a WAO paper. No one's attending from WAO because I think this one is largely a formality, is it not? So perhaps we could wrap up both. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that, Chair. I'll briefly introduce item 10 and item 11 that is linked to item 10, so I'll just give you a bit of background where that's come from, but it is largely for information. So here to present today an overview of our performance management arrangements, and this is part of an annual report we bring to Audit Committee appraising the effectiveness of those arrangements. The main elements that make up the framework are in Appendix 2, and clearly it's important that these arrangements are working effectively so we can plan and evaluate how our services are performing across the council. I'll briefly go through the framework in terms of the individual elements, but I won't linger on them because I can't just not taking up too much of your time in introduction. So we've got the wellbeing objectives, which translate our vision into a series of objectives we look to deliver. Our service planning arrangements, which provide more detail each service provides on what they're planning to do in the year, how they're going to evaluate performance, how they're going to manage their risks. And then we've got employee aims and objectives, which clearly are important to look at how individuals contribute to our objectives and also look at any training and development needs of individuals in the authority. Around that then, we've got a few processes that are clearly fundamental and run throughout the framework. So we've got our performance data and monitoring, so how we use that to plan and evaluate the effectiveness of our services. And we've also got our strategic risk assessment, which looks at how we plan, manage and mitigate some of our strategic risks. And a report on the strategic risk assessment will come forward into future audit committees, as you have a role in your assurance around those arrangements. And also then our self-evaluation arrangements, which again are throughout the process in how we evaluate, learn from what we've done and plan for the future. So that's a very, very quick run through. In terms of each section of the report, to be clear, this is an appraisal of the effectiveness of the arrangements, not necessarily the performance shown in those arrangements. So it is about the effectiveness, not necessarily the performance. Although we'd hope there'd be a correlation between the two. Each section sets out the purpose, so the main function of the arrangements. This is in Appendix 1. It provides the evaluation score, and that's based on our self-evaluation framework. So that's from level 6, excellent, to level 1, unsatisfactory. The position then draws in findings from a range of evidence. That includes external Wales Audit Office inspection reports, and we've reflected some of their key findings where relevant to those arrangements. Also feedback from internal audit and some of from the work programme Andrew's just described to you. And then also then we set out some future actions we're looking to take to strengthen those arrangements. So that's briefly sort of item 10. Item 11 is linked to it, and this is a certificate of compliance from Wales Audit Office, where they have a duty to audit if we discharged our duty to publish an assessment of performance in line with a local government measure. And as members will be aware, we do this through the publication of our Stage 2 improvement plan, which was called How We Are Performing in 2016-17 in this case, which was presented to full council in September and was published then in October on our website. And we did some social media communication and summary of that as well. And this certificate basically just confirms that we have met those statutory requirements, and the certificate there sets out some of the limitations in terms of what Wales Audit Office look at and what they don't look at in order to issue that certificate. So it's largely just to say we've met the requirements for information. So this covers the two items. I'm happy to take any questions from the committee, Chair.
Let's throw that open then. Questions and observations, please. Just give us a moment to reflect. Yeah. Yes. Well, given that that we've got the WAO audit as well attached to it, I mean, I think we've got a certain level of assurance on this. So I will just note then, unless anyone wants to chime in now, I'll just note that members can familiarise themselves with the Council's performance framework to ensure they understand the parts of the system that must work together to deliver improvement, and members can use the update provided to seek assurance on the operation of the authority's performance management arrangements and identify any areas where there needs to be action needs to be taken or further information provided. So, Councillor Smith.
One item, the check-in and the check-out. It's something that arose at Strong Communities Select Committee, and it's being followed through there. So it is an issue that's ongoing elsewhere. Thank you.
Do you have anything to add on that?
I think rightly sort of that sets out in terms of where the arrangements are and the progress that's being made. But I know that Strong Communities Select Committee are keen to keep track of that and how people have an appraisals, how effective those appraisals are in terms of the training needs identified, etc. for individuals.
I think, Chairman, it's very useful as documented, sort of a follow through of the process, not looking at the issue, but there's your process, there's your system, and this is how we have to work. Thank you.
No, I think that was flagged up to us as a possible concerned area when I discussed it with someone yesterday. So, thanks for noting that. Yeah, thank you. The next item on the agenda then is the audited or examined trust funds. Now, we've got two items here, 12 and 13. Now, the item 13, which is about the formal ISO reports, I understand that they've been received by the council, but they weren't received in time to distribute them to members in such a way as members would be able to reflect on them and consider it properly. I don't think we've got any concerns in this area at all, but what I'm proposing to do is that we actually postpone 12 and 13 until next time. So if there's no further comments on that, observations on that? Yes, Mr. Howcroft.
Just to be a bit more of a cathartic experience, I think the chair's going lightly on me there. It's more of a case that actually they were forwarded on, but actually in forwarding them on, I didn't actually check that they were actually included on the agenda, so one of them has gone on the agenda and one hasn't. It would be simpler and more straightforward if you actually saw the accounts with the representative audit assessment. So if it's okay with you, as the chair suggests, we'd like to just put that back to January's date, which is actually the original date that it was going to be looked at in the calendar anyway.
So thanks for that. So that's postponed. We can just quickly note the forward work programme. It's there for us to see. Unless anyone's got anything they want to say about it at this stage. No? Okay, thank you very much. Just because it's on the agenda, I'll note the date and time of the next meeting being the 11th of January. Treasury management training is going to follow the next two items. Item 17 is to resolve to exclude the press and public from the meeting during consideration of the following item of business in accordance with Section 100A of the Local Government Act as amended on the grounds that it involves information as defined in paragraph 12 of Part 4 of Schedule 12A to the Act. There is more explanation of this in the item 17, which is included in your agenda. If we're moved and seconded, thank you. So we'll do that. So we're going to cease the live streaming at this point.